Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Ray. Ray is a 2004 Oscar-winning film starring Jamie Foxx and a biopic about the life and career of legendary musician Ray Charles Robinson, better known as Ray Charles. Over the course of the film, we see how traumatic moments from Ray's childhood continue to haunt and impact him as an adult. There's also some insight into his career from the perspective of both its creative milestones and business dealings. The film begins with Ray as a young adult trying to get started as a professional musician. He's been playing the piano for years at this point, but lacking connections is trying to gain entry to the music industry by joining a live band. It can be difficult for any musician who's just getting started on their professional journey, but things are further complicated by Ray being blind and black in the Jim Crow South. Unfortunately, as with many black artists of his time and even into the present, Ray was swindled by his handlers. In this case, he was especially vulnerable because of his vision impairment. His early managers, Gossie McGee and Marlene, collect earnings on his behalf, but then brush him off instead of providing an accurate accounting of what's coming in and or placing money directly in his control. Marlene is also a low-key Jane, in the sense that she starts out by allowing Ray to stay at her home in exchange for him servicing her sexual desires. Not only is this woman controlling his money, but she's also taking sexual advantage of him because she knows that he's just arrived in town and doesn't have much. I mean, it just felt icky. Not only was she sexually exploiting this young man, but then turned around and stole from him. I remember as a kid that my mom would constantly tell me that I should never lie because liars become thieves. This young man is obviously talented, which results in various people trying to latch on to him. Keep in mind that at this point, Ray is still just playing live shows. He hasn't even reached the point of recording. It's still early in his career, but he's starting to generate money, which is making the people around him money, especially because some of them are taking more than their fair share. It offers a peek into the reality of what a lot of artists had to deal with and still deal with. Early on in their career, they're desperate to break into the industry and or for money. Others recognize their talent, or at least the potential for them to be marketable, and latch on to them early in their careers. This results in some musicians signing questionable contracts or otherwise entering into unfavorable agreements. Those who aren't business savvy or financially astute find themselves dealing with the long-lasting ramifications of these early business dealings. The issue with Gossie and Marlene doesn't seem to be a matter of them tying Ray up with unfair contract terms. Instead, they're double dipping in his money and cutting side deals to enrich themselves. There's an obvious conflict of interest where the person negotiating deals on Ray's behalf is also collecting the money. They could tell him whatever is convenient while stealing because there's no unbiased oversight. Gossie and Marlene saw Ray as a country bumpkin and his naivete as an opportunity to take advantage of him. Fortunately, a friend gave him a heads up early on, which helped him realize that he was being taken advantage of and enabled him to take steps to remedy the situation. People are greedy and foolish at the same time. Ray's managers had been benefiting from his talent as they collected a share from his traveling and performing. They would have been better off giving him his proper share of the money and otherwise treating him fairly. This would have likely resulted in them working with him for a longer amount of time and thus earning more money in the long term. Granted, the entertainment industry can be fickle, so it's hard to tell how long an entertainer's career is going to be on an upswing. Their approach was short-sighted, but maybe they were trying to grab all that they could while they could. They probably never imagined the degree of success that he would achieve and likely weren't even looking that far down the road. While I might not know everyone, I do have some knowledge of the music industry. With the film, we meet a very young Quincy Jones, portrayed by Larenz Tate, but we never hear anything else about the first managers after Ray drops them. They're also not industry professionals I've heard about in real life. It's likely safe to assume that even if they went on to achieve great things with other artists, they certainly didn't become household names. Now traveling and working with a new band, Ray moves closer to the spotlight as he begins to function as the warm-up act and later the band leader. There are examples of some people being compassionate and looking out for Ray because of his inability to see. But yet again, at least in part due to his vision impairment, we see that others are not very kind. Some members of the band view him as a burden because he needs a little bit of help. So I suspect that, some of this ill treatment was a result of jealousy, as some of the musicians saw him trying to move up and make progress. I remember that during the promotional period for the film, Jamie Foxx mentioned speaking with Ray about his experiences as a blind man, and he even had some experiences like this as well, where people took their ability to see for granted, and after sharing a meal or otherwise gathered, the group would sometimes get up and walk away, leaving Ray behind. They weren't necessarily intending to be mean or cruel, but because they had all of their senses, they could move about more freely and without having to actively think. At times, being in the physical dark of blindness and then finding himself alone in the sense that nobody else understood like his experiences. Ray felt lonely. Here it is that Ray was trying to get his music career started, which can be difficult for most people. But going through these negative experiences as a newbie with the added difficulty of an impairment made things even more complicated. To a degree, Ray's blindness resonated with me because my grandfather's sister developed vision issues which resulted in her going blind as an adult. My mother's maternal and paternal sides of the family seem to both suffer from vision issues, though thus far I thankfully seem to be unaffected. As a young child, I was absolutely terrified of my great aunt and would just run away from her, so I have very few memories of her. But in the years since, I've learned more about how vision impaired and blind people learn to navigate the world, and it's truly incredible and inspiring. Putting aside kids not knowing any better, as humans, it's a benefit to us all to be compassionate and considerate. I don't understand not being courteous and offering a bit of grace to someone under these circumstances. It takes time, but Ray progresses towards being his own musical entity and moves up to becoming a frontman and later a recording artist. With that, there's also some discussion of the evolution of his sound. The progression of making creatives is they begin by taking inspiration from and recreating the things that are already out there. They then start to experiment and create entirely new things of their own. You see Ray finding his voice as a musician and then forming a crew around himself, which consists of not just his band, but also his business handlers and representatives. One of the key people that enters Ray's life is Della Beatrice Howard, played by Kerry Washington, the woman that would become his wife. It was still several years before Kerry Washington would star in Scandal and become a big name in her own right. At this point, Washington was on a run of appearing in some fairly well-regarded films in which her male co-stars would be nominated for or win notable awards. While the films were critical and/or commercial successes, raising Washington's profile, her roles in the films were typically the wife or partner of the male lead, with a thin storyline in comparison. It's an unfortunate reality of the limited roles and limitations within the roles that are available for a lot of female actresses, especially Black actresses. In this case, once Ray decides to marry Della, who's referred to as B, she pretty much stays at home and will later take care of their children while he's out on the road. B comes from a religious family and is herself religious to the point that she objects to Ray taking a gospel song and changing it to a love song. The two meet and begin seeing each other, and after a brief separation due to Ray traveling for business, he decides that he wants to marry B, which results in a wedding and the two moving in together. This gives rise to a clear divide between Ray's home life with his legal wife and his single and everything but name life out on the road. Early on before meeting B, Ray is shown to be sleeping around with women after feeling up their wrist to assess their body type and supposed attractiveness. This continues in a sense even after he gets married, but becomes arguably more reckless as he begins, or at least is now shown to be having affairs with the women in his band. I will never understand the point of asking someone to marry you or accepting someone's proposal if you plan to secretly continue living as a single person. Marriage isn't for everyone. Why not just remain single and then have entanglements with whomever you want without having to sneak around? It just seems like a lot of unnecessary wasted energy. But then again, sometimes people get themselves into these situations because they just like having drama in their lives, because it might be convenient, but makes absolutely no sense to start sleeping with what are essentially your coworkers, or more accurately, your employees. Being a married man in the public eye who's cheating on his wife is problematic. Musicians, even back then, were notorious for having one-night stands. But it's not like now where everyone has a camera phone and the paparazzi are all about. Some random woman in a completely different town is one thing, but cheating with women that you have to see and work with every day and who know your wife just seems like you're asking for trouble, especially because Ray wasn't just sleeping with these women, but rather seemed to be playing house with them on the road. They were taking this whole work husband and work wife nonsense to a whole other level. The first woman, Marianne Fisher, played by Anjanou Ellis, shows up for an audition and is singing gospel music and talking about loving the Lord. Minutes later, she's pressed up all types of close to Ray, but now singing and swapping spit with him. Not to absolve Ray from his role in this entanglement, as he's the one that was married, but Marianne knew that he was married and chose to entertain him in his nonsense. Your married lover is cheating on their spouse, and you might be cheating on yourself, but your married lover can't be cheating on you. How do you turn around and get upset that he's seeing someone else? Why are you surprised that a person who is lying and cheating on their supposed partner is lying and cheating to be with someone aside from you? Aside from delusion, what would make you so special to not receive the same treatment? And then adding more fuel to this ridiculous fire is the second mistress, Margie Hendricks, played by Regina King. By the time she arrives on the scene, Ray has a wife, mistress, and who knows how many other women. Marianne seems upset about being replaced as the first mistress, but not necessarily Ray being married. When she gets fed up and leaves, Margie begins fussing about him not leaving his wife and goes so far as to show up in LA. He's obviously not a paragon of virtue. This man is obviously for the streets. But here are these women fighting to take him home. It's all a matter of ego. Typically, I don't blame the other woman because you never know what the man is telling her. I certainly believe that these women engaged in affairs with Ray, but at the same time, because the story is told from his perspective, I take it with a grain of salt. It's completely possible that in reality, he might have been feeding these women all types of lies and stories, giving them the false impression that they could have some kind of a future. In high school, my mom's boyfriend, who'd been a musician in his youth, put me on to some old school artists from the 70s and 80s. In college, I branched out a bit more into music, especially after reading Dreamgirls by Mary Wilson of the Supremes. So I was kind of shocked, because these were like grown, middle-aged to old people by the time I was born. But you wouldn't believe the drama and entanglements that they had back in their day. People complain about the youth of today, but they're not doing anything new. The only difference is that things are more out in the open. As with most people, some of the drama and dysfunction in Ray's life as an adult originated in his childhood. Sure, there's the physical issue of him losing his sight as a child, but also watching his mother struggle to provide for him and his brother, and witnessing the traumatic accidental drowning of his brother. There are flashbacks to Ray as a child, and we see his mother throughout the film. She's working very hard as a washerwoman to provide for her two sons. At one point, Ray mentions that his mother worked herself into an early grave, yet we never see his father, and I don't recall there being any mention of him. Coming of age in Florida during the 1930s to 1940s as not just a black boy, but a blind black boy is rough. Ray manages to work his way out of the South and heads to big cities in the North with hopes of making a way for himself as a musician. During a conversation with B, he explains that as a blind black man, his options were very limited. Music was a thing that his mother recognized as being a skill that he could use to earn a good living and escape from struggling in the South. Where other parents pressed their kids to learn handicrafts or a trade, once he found music, Ray's mother pushed him to pursue that as his path. Having children after achieving some degree of success motivated Ray to relocate to Los Angeles, where he hoped his children could have more and better opportunities. There are relatively few scenes with him and his children, and while he interacts with the kids, he doesn't exactly seem to be a devoted dad. Putting aside that he's carrying on with women on the road, he's working to support his family and to give them the things that he didn't have growing up. I never begrudge a parent doing what they have to do to put food on the table for themselves and their child. But while it seems he financially gives his children more than his parents were able to give to him, it doesn't seem that he was as present in their lives as his mother was in his. In one instance, he promises to pay for his son's baseball team's uniforms and whatever other equipment they might need, but won't be available to attend his son's baseball event. B points out that while the boy didn't fuss, he's disappointed as he was very much looking forward to his father attending the event. It's one thing when he's out of town for work, but when he's in town, he should try to make up for his absence by being present. By all means, chase your dreams, pursue your passions, and work to provide for your family, but you also have to make time for your family. People who are creatively inclined tend to use their art as a positive outlet for their thoughts and feelings. Unfortunately, some people, whether creative or non-creative, turn to alcohol, drugs, sex, and other substances or behaviors as a means of coping with or escaping from their thoughts and feelings. I'm no medical professional, but it seems like some people with substance abuse or addictive habits tend to have some kind of underlying mental health issue or have experienced some type of trauma. They turn to these substances and behaviors as an unhealthy means of coping with their problems. In Ray's case, he experienced witnessing his brother's death, losing his mother, and losing his sight. These incidents would be traumatic for anyone, and Ray is still carrying their effects around with him many years later. He hasn't dealt with and certainly hasn't spoken to anyone about the pain and sense of loss that he feels. Instead, he's found incredibly unhealthy but ultimately inefficient ways to cope with his pain. Drugs do nothing but add more problems to his life and kick the can of dealing with his inner turmoil down the road. We might not have all had the same experiences, but we've all been through things in our lives. When I was a kid, Ray Charles was an old man with a head full of white hair. The only song of his that I knew then was from watching the reruns of The Cosby Show and seeing them perform Nighttime is the Right Time, which I likely didn't even know was his song. To see this fictionalized account of Ray Charles carrying on as a young man was eye-opening when I first saw it. Yet while this is an entertaining film, it's worth noting that it's somewhat like a simplified and Hollywood version of Ray's life. That's not to imply that Ray is presented here as a saint in comparison to who he was in real life, but rather that some key elements of his life that might have offered more insight into him as a man were glossed over, if not excluded from the movie. Watching this time around, I noticed that his dad wasn't around from quite a young age, and there's seemingly no mention of him. While watching, I did a quick Google search about Ray Charles, and it turns out that there was like a whole scandal surrounding his birth. Ray's grandmother died when his mother, Aretha Williams, was still quite young. Aretha's father, which is Ray's grandfather, was still alive, but for whatever reason was unable to care for Aretha. A co-worker of Aretha's father and his wife, Bailey and Mary Jane Robinson, informally adopted Aretha, and she took the Robinson surname, becoming Aretha Robinson. After living with the Robinsons for a few years, at the age of 15, it was discovered that Aretha was pregnant. Bailey, Aretha's adoptive father, was also her unborn child's father. As often occurred when underage girls or unwed women became pregnant, Aretha left Greenville, Florida, and went to stay with family in Albany, Georgia, until after she had the baby. Following the child's birth, Aretha returned to Greenville with little Ray Charles Robinson and raised the boy with assistance from her adoptive mother, Mary Jane Robinson, who had lost a son of her own. I try not to use profanity on this show, so I'll just simply say that, continuing to be an absolutely atrocious person, Bailey Robinson abandoned his family, wife, child, and everyone else included, left town, and married another woman. Mess. Aretha had already given birth to George by the time Ray turned 1, and the identity of George's father was forgotten over the years. It's unclear if Ray had any contact with Bailey later in his life. Let's break that down for a second. Aretha was 15 or maybe 16 when she gave birth to Ray, and had a second child less than a year later. So by the age of 17 or 18, Aretha was a single black woman trying to raise 2 children in the Jim Crow South with some assistance from Mary Jane, but seemingly no help from their father or fathers. George died in her washtub, resulting in tremendous grief at the loss for both her and Ray. And around this time, Ray began having vision issues and was completely blind by about the age of 7. It's unclear what Aretha's life was like before her mother passed away, but it certainly sounds like life got incredibly hard for her afterward. Already mourning the loss of one child, Aretha made the sacrifice of sending her only remaining son away to attend a school for the blind in hopes of giving him a better life. Ray had to move 163 miles away to St. Augustine, where he attended the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind from the age of 7 to 14. According to Google in the present, this is a 2.5-hour drive by car, so I would assume that back in the late 1930s to early 40s, this wasn't a convenient trip without a vehicle. Thus, once enrolled, Ray probably spent most of his time at the school and infrequently traveled back and forth. Yet tragedy would strike again, with Aretha tragically dying at the relatively young age of 29. The glimpses that we see during the movie are rough, but the full story is even more heartbreaking. We see and understand Ray's drive to work hard and insistence on being paid what he's worth. Unfortunately, we also see him being an absentee dad and a womanizing husband. The examples of being a man and father as provided by his own father and likely some of the other men around him were not positive. Thus, he financially provided for his wife and children, enabling B to not have to struggle and work so hard, and given his children the opportunity to attend better schools and get an education. But he didn't give them the time that they needed, as he likely felt the money was enough. Some of their disagreements around these issues and Ray's drug use are shown in the film, but the movie seems to imply that Ray and B remained married. The reality is that the couple divorced after 22 years due to Ray's addiction, affairs, and otherwise problematic behavior. Ray is already a 2.5-hour movie, and it doesn't really get into the deep details of his early life. I understand this would be an incredibly long movie if it delved deeper into his backstory, and I'm not saying it's what happened here, but sometimes when a subject is deeply involved or even just providing approval in a project, it might affect what is included or excluded. As I mentioned, my great aunt was also blind, but in her case, she lost her vision as an adult. I don't know if, like Ray, it was a gradual process, but from what I've learned, she was getting ready for work one day and suddenly couldn't see. My family is not currently rich, nor were they wealthy back then, but, like everyone was or is at least comfortable. My great aunt had a support system in the form of at least her mother and brother, my grandfather, as well as a local school for the blind where she was able to learn how to adapt to and navigate this new world. Here it is that you have this young boy whose mother is already struggling financially and emotionally. It's possible that Aretha might have attended some school, but likely didn't get very far. Probably due to life circumstances, but also living in the Jim Crow South where education opportunities were limited for Black people. She lost one child, and then her only remaining child was dealing with a serious medical issue. This resulted in her pushing him to be independent and self-reliant, which she hoped would help Ray make a comfortable place for himself in the world despite his being blind. In part, a parent's job is to teach their children the life skills needed for when they become independent adults. Aretha does what she can to teach Ray how to navigate the world, but there was only so far that she could personally take him, and so she made the difficult decision to send him away to school in hopes that he would get the help that he needed. We see Ray as an adult, and things aren't easy for him, as it takes some effort for him to navigate the world, and he does occasionally require extra assistance. But he's relatively independent, and we see the little tips and tricks that he's learned to make his way through the physical world. And even putting aside his obvious musical talent, Ray's journey as a human is inspiring. His womanizing and absenteeism as a father is shown, but not fully explored. I think this was in part because of the scandal of his birth, but also because its influence in part by society's patriarchy and sexism. This behavior was especially prevalent and arguably excused at that time, and still to a degree in the present, as being a part of manhood. Thus, while these shortcomings are touched on, they're portrayed as being less a product of his traumatic childhood in comparison to his drug use. We see flashbacks and you get an understanding of his need for independence, drive to control his music, and rightful demand to be paid properly. He reacts strongly to people attempting to take advantage of him, which is completely understandable. We see the demons of guilt and helplessness that he battles, but other aspects of his development are left unexplored. Ray is shown womanizing early on in the film as a single man, but it continues even after he gets married. He supposedly loves Bea, and you get the impression that his main affairs were just with these two women in his band. Marianne cuts ties with Ray, but Margie sticks around and becomes pregnant. The movie gives the impression that Ray was married once and had maybe like 3 or 4 children, 2 to 3 with Bea and 1 with Margie. But the reality is that Ray had a daughter from a teenage relationship and was briefly married before Bea. He would ultimately have 12 children with 10 women. And it's mentioned that his obsession with women began after he lost his virginity at the age of 12 to a 20-year-old woman. There's a lot to unpack there with regard to this generational child exploitation that was experienced by both Ray and Aretha, yet little of the resulting dysfunction is explored. I didn't do any extensive research, but just noticed that there was no mention of his dad and ended up reading a bit more into his backstory on Wikipedia and like a few other websites. It became clear that some important life-shaping stuff was just glossed over. Jamie Foxx did an incredible job in the role, and the performances from the other actors in the adult part of Ray's life were very good. But I didn't think the acting in some of the scenes depicting Ray as a child was quite as good. Part of it is that some of the flashback scenes, especially later in the film between Ray and Aretha, felt a bit melodramatic. The acting was great and the story was good, but I still feel like this was a bit of a missed opportunity. It's certainly not a bad movie, but it felt like the movie fell into this trope surrounded tortured creatives and drug use. That's certainly part of Ray's story, but looking at it almost 20 years later, it feels like the formula of the typical music biopic. Granted, Ray came out in 2004, and several similar movies came out after, so it's not a matter of Ray on its own copying or otherwise being unoriginal. It's more a matter of the film touching on the same subjects and issues that other movies in the genre touch on, while continuing to leave some aspects unexplored. Nowadays, they don't really make 3 or 4 hour movies, and I don't know too many people willing to sit through something of that length. But looking at the movie through the lens of the little I learned about his life, I now feel like this can't be considered the definitive movie about Ray Charles. It's a good and entertaining movie about him and his life, but not the movie about Ray Charles and his life. That's a missed opportunity because Foxx was a very good choice to play Ray Charles. 2004 was a very big year for Jamie Foxx, as Collateral and Redemption, the Stan Tookie Williams story, were also released that year. I think that year marked his transition to Hollywood superstar, as prior to that he'd mostly appeared in comedies and movies that weren't that great. Fox started out as a comedian and is a funny dude, but as I believe with good comedians, their knack for timing can help some become very good dramatic actors, while not many dramatic actors are as capable of transitioning to being good in comedic roles. Like his other roles in 2004, Fox did a great job portraying Ray Charles, but with Fox's acting and a deeper story, the film could have been even better. Fox is older now, and if he decided to make a remake or create a new version of the Ray Charles story, I don't know that he'd be able to physically pull it off at this point. Likewise, revisiting the story as a new film will probably only work with a fresh perspective, and I feel like most people would think that they already got the full story the first time around. These kinds of stories need time to unfold and are sometimes better covered in documentaries, as I realized much the same with Tina versus What's Love Got to Do with It. The fictional story is entertaining and becomes a classic movie, but pales in comparison to the deep, fact-based documentary. There are layers to human lives, especially given the experiences of some of these notable people. Sometimes movies can only take you so far, and a well-produced documentary is needed to really do the subject and their life justice. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more movie recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.